people come on so we don't start without you. Okay, we're going to start. Welcome, everyone, to the webinar today on the changing industry of credit card processing. If there's any audio issues, which we don't anticipate any, but GoToWebinar did have one a couple months ago, we have a backup. So I typed in a number in the bottom right hand of your screen. It's an 800 number. If there's any problems, we'll hang up and we'll call into that number and we'll just resume. But I'm going to also give you the number. It's 800-410-3590, and then the passcode would be 9786917 and pound. Okay, I'm Melissa Joels with Impact, and Jerry Smith of Ignite Payments and First Data is your presenter today. The presentation will take about 30 minutes, and I just wanted to let everybody know that we are recording it. So we'll post it on the Impact Collision Solutions website under the training video, so you can refer back to it. And we will also follow up by sending everyone on the call today a copy of the presentation with Jerry's contact information. So if you have further questions, you can follow up. And then today, if you have questions, you have a couple options. You can type them in the bottom right hand of your screen in the chat box, or at the end, we'll have time for question and answers. And if you raise your hand, I can unclick you individually one at a time, and you can ask the question. Okay? With that, I'm going to turn it over to Jerry.
All right, well, thank you, Melissa, and welcome everyone that's on the call. It's my understanding that there are several members on the call currently that we are managing your merchant account, so some of this may be a refresher. But for those that I have not had the opportunity to speak to, my name is Jerry Smith. I've been in the payment space now for going on 18 years. And I usually start my presentations off by saying the credit card industry, I think about 30 days into my career, I realized that the credit card industry was a legalized racket. And ultimately, the best thing any merchant can do is find a reputable company that's going to offer them the only pricing model that actually benefits the merchant, and then have somebody that you can count on if and when you need assistance. So with that being said, the talking points we're going to cover today kind of break down who are the companies. First Data, there's a high probability that some of you are using First Data today. Talk specifically about who Ignite Payments is in the equation, the different pricing models for the industry as a whole, downgrades, how to avoid them. Ultimately, downgrades can cost companies thousands of dollars annually. The different processing options available to merchants. Security, probably the biggest buzzword in the industry right now. We'll touch on some recent breaches, talk about PCI compliance in general, and then First Data's solution to the security component called TransArmor. Been a lot of changes in the industry over the last few years, as well as an upcoming change in the fall of 2015 that we'll touch on. Briefly touch on the benefits of the Impact partnership, and then like Melissa said, we'll open it up for Q&A at the end. So who is First Data? They're the #1 acquirer in the merchant industry, and they drive 70% of all the transactions in the U.S. The reason they're able to drive 70% is they have approximately 600 channels that resell their services. Most of them are banks. Obviously, Ignite Payments, we'll get into that one on the next slide. But the takeaway from this slide is every channel has to be able to compete. Otherwise, they become a monopoly. So Ignite Payments, we're simply one of the 600 channels of First Data. A huge advantage we have over the other 599 channels is we're actually owned by First Data. So essentially our parent charges us less to move those credit card dollars, and as you will see later on in the presentation, we're just willing to work on very small margins. The Ignite Payments channel, we have over 400 agent offices throughout the U.S. The agent office that I run is located in Scottsdale, Arizona, and we're very much a niched market or a niched office in the sense of we've created 60 different endorsements with groups very similar to Impact. We're currently managing over $700 million in annual credit card receipts, and what really speaks to the viability of the program is that we have less than 1% attrition in our entire portfolio. Okay, let's get into the different ways a processor can bill a merchant. There's only 6 of them. I'm putting them on there almost in the order that we see them when it comes to statements. But tiered pricing, hands down, is the most popular. You would see things on your statement like qualified, mid-qualified, non-qualified. We call those buckets in the industry. Again, 80% of the statements that come across our desk are of some tiered variety. The next one is base rate plus surcharges. You will look at your statement. You will see a base rate somewhere, very transparent. And then there's a list of surcharges. And that's pretty much where all the transparency goes away. Another very popular one is called an algorithm. More or less, they break down your aggregate volume. They tell you what your fees are. It's very vague information. And unfortunately, only one side of the equation knows the formula to that algorithm. And you can be rest assured it's not the merchant. Bill backs, this was a pricing model that was probably introduced to the industry about 5 years ago. Very similar to an algorithm. I would say it's hands down the most convoluted billing method in the industry. Flat rate, this is extremely rare. It has become more popular over the last, say, 12 to 18 months. When you think of mobile products, most mobile apps are a flat rate. Ours is not, but that is the norm in the industry. And then we're going to talk about interchange plus pricing. This is the only pricing model in the industry that actually benefits the merchant, and it's because it's completely transparent, and it's the only pricing model that the processor cannot manipulate. So a very common question we're asked is, well, what is interchange? It's really no different. If you think of your industry, everything that you sell has an inherent cost to you. So think of interchange in that same format. It's essentially what MasterCard, Visa, and Discover charge, and the interchange is the same regardless of the processor. It's based on two factors. The risk associated with that transaction, right? Is it swiped versus keyed? And how rich is the rewards program? Okay, because you, the merchant, you ultimately pay for all the free round-trip tickets, rental cars, etc. So there's nothing we can do about the reward side of it. There are a few variables that we can do from a risk standpoint, and we'll get to that on a future slide. And then the takeaway here is that 90% of your bill is going to ultimately come from the interchange dues and assessments portion. It's extremely important. So downgrades. I put on here that they're unavoidable. And what I mean by unavoidable is the second you hand key a transaction, it's going to downgrade 15 basis points. You lose that as a bare minimum. Keep in mind 100 basis points equals 1%. So what can you ultimately, you see where it says what causes the transaction. So you key it, it goes to 15 basis points. There's then an address verification prompt. So anybody on this call who currently hand keys one, the terminal or the device you're using should prompt for the street address and the zip code. As long as you can tell the applicable association, right, Visa, MasterCard, Discover, that even though I'm hand keying this, the fact that I know where my customer's bill is mailed lowers the level of risk, subsequently lowers the interchange. I put on there you'll lose an additional 30 to 70 basis points depending on the type of card. If you think about it, there's two components, the numeric street number and then the zip code. Very common, you ask your customer, where's your bill mailed? They give you their office address. Well, in reality, it's mailed across the street to a P.O. box. The zip code matches, but the street number does not. It partially downgrades, costs your company probably between 30 and 40 basis points. All of a sudden, you miss both variables. Now you're going to downgrade as high as 70 basis points. Again, that's almost a full percent. Most of the people on this call today are working on smaller margins than we ever have. There is no need to give up almost a full percent, especially back to Visa, MasterCard, or Discover, because they have plenty of money. Solutions to the problem, number one, perform an internal audit after all keyed transactions. If you're using a standalone terminal today, when that receipt prints, there will be what they call an ABS legend line item on that receipt. And it'll usually have a YYY for yes, 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 or an NNN for no, no, no. The first variable is the street number. The second variable is the zip code. and the third variable is the CVV2 code or the security code. Believe it or not, and I'm not quite sure why this is, but the security code plays no bearing on the overall cost. That is simply a fraud protector for the merchant to verify that whoever they're speaking to, they do have the card in their possession, and they can at least give you that code. Okay, and then the other one on here says utilize GGE4 and activate the AVS mismatch feature. GGE4, which we'll get to on another slide, it's just a gateway or a virtual terminal. There are numerous, probably thousands of gateways in the industry, but if you can think about yourself personally, you've gone online at some point, maybe purchased a plane ticket, or you've bought merchandise. You always have to put in your billing address, the dollar amount of the transaction, etc. Well, if you're like me and you transpose numbers from time to time, you go hit submit and it tells you there's an error on the screen. You then go up, you realize your zip code was incorrect, you change that to match, whatever your legitimate zip code is, you hit submit, it's magically approved. So these gateways have that same component. And the reason we're a huge fan of that is when you think of the transactions that walk in the front door, those have a tendency to be a lower average ticket. But if I'm calling you on the phone, a lot of times I'm possibly paying a bill. That can be 3 or 4 times the size of your average ticket. The last thing you want to do in that environment is leave close to 1% on the table. Talk about different processing options. Probably still the most common, I believe the last number I heard was 85% of merchants in the United States use a standalone terminal. We reference on here the FD100, very popular terminal that we sell. It has the ability to obtain authorizations through a regular phone line, which we refer to as dial-up, or it can go over Ethernet or go over the internet, which if speed at the point of sale is critical, we highly encourage everybody to be on the Ethernet connection. You've got wireless terminals, the FD400. That is a great terminal to take to potentially trade shows, or if you're out in the field and the end user is wanting a receipt, like an actual hard copy receipt, the FD400 would be the solution. I will tell you that mobile devices are becoming more and more popular. First Data, in my opinion, has the best mobile device on the market. Most people have heard of Square, and that is a very common one. They've probably done, in my opinion, the best job from a marketing perspective, but there are a lot of disadvantages of Square versus the First Data mobile app. The number one difference is the reader that we use with the First Data mobile app is actually encrypted. So from a security perspective, that is absolutely critical. The other component is if you're using Square today to process mobile payments, most people do not know this, but the second you sign up for the Square service, you are authorizing Square. You're essentially telling Square that your customers that you run cards on, those are their customers now. And Square subsequently sells all of that data to third parties. Right? We've all received solicitations, from somebody trying to sell us something, and you always want to know where they're getting our information from. Well, if you're doing business with Square, indirectly, you're providing that information. Gateway, or as a lot of companies refer to it as a virtual terminal, this is really a great solution for what we refer to as MOTO accounts, which is mail order, telephone order, or card not present. And then if you do any sort of recurring billing, a gateway is great because it'll store the credit card information. You can set up the billing to recur, whether it's weekly, biweekly, quarterly. I mean, you have complete control over that. And then the last one is the variety of software applications. It is extremely rare. When you think of First Data as a company, they're touching or driving 70% of all the transactions in the U.S. It is very rare that we're not compatible with your current setup. But ultimately, we want to learn about your current setup, make sure that you're doing everything possible from a security perspective, and just make sure that the environment that you're processing in today is the most efficient for your exact setup. A little bit more on the GGE4. There are no licensing fees or startup costs. A lot of gateways do have an upfront cost to get associated with them. You have a virtual terminal component, which is if you were going to sit at your computer and facilitate a payment from a customer. The API plugin, I'm by no means technical, but that essentially will attach to a shopping cart and enable e-commerce transactions. We touched on the recurring billing on the previous slide. Their help desk is there 24/7, 365. It is obviously PCI compliant, and it comes with TransArmor, which I'm going to get to here in just a minute. And probably the best or the biggest takeaway from this slide is that First Data's gateway has never been breached. So security, I had mentioned at the previous or at the start of the presentation that this is hands down the biggest buzzword in the industry. I just recently attended a First Data conference in Atlanta, and needless to say, security was probably 50% of it. Most of the people on this call either heard of the Target breach or were impacted by the Target breach. 100 million records ended up getting through. What's interesting about the Target breach is it was a $3,000 malware program that enabled that cyber criminal to pick up 100 million records. When you think of the ROI on paying $3,000 to pick up 100 million credit card numbers, not a bad ROI for the criminal. Neiman Marcus, 1 million records. And then just recently, I did a presentation yesterday, and on my way to the presentation, I received an email from First Data that Sally Beauty just announced yesterday in the news that they had 25,000 records get breached. So the problem with the breach is numerous problems with it, but first and foremost, you have to notify, even if one of your customers was breached, you would have to notify your entire customer base that their records might have been impacted. The fines and the penalties that are going to be handed down to these large retailers are going to be astronomical. My guess in the Target, I mean, this will shake out over time, but I think they will probably have fines in excess of $100 million. But the one piece that Target will never be able to quantify is consumer confidence, because that's something, I mean, if you heard or read anything about it, I believe there was a 10-day period where they gave everybody 10% off at the point of sale during the holidays. Millions of dollars went out the door just giving that 10% off. And within the last, I believe, 3 or 4 weeks, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal where the CEO was specifically talking about he has no clue how they are going to ultimately regain the consumer confidence. So it's a situation where you obviously don't want to be breached. You're not necessarily in an environment where you're going to be a target per se, but here's the reality. Small to medium-sized businesses are getting breached on a daily basis. The only difference is it doesn't make the front page of the Wall Street Journal. First Data's created a great, we kind of consider it, PCI for dummies. It's their PCI portal called Rapid Comply. It takes probably less than 20 minutes to complete your annual certificate. And depending on what terminals you're using, a lot of our customers use FD terminals. It actually shortens that questionnaire. And then I put TransArmor on here at the end. And what TransArmor does, as soon as that transaction leaves the terminal, it encrypts all of the credit card data. When the response comes back approved, it comes back in the form of a token, or what they refer to as tokenization. If you go back to the Target scenario, if Target would have had TransArmor, the malware would have still gotten into their system. The only difference is they would have pulled out 100 million tokens, which are essentially worthless. And First Data is so confident that they would be worthless, they say in the event that you're breached through the terminal using TransArmor, First Data is on the hook for any and all fines. So that is a proprietary product to First Data, absolutely critical that you're using something to encrypt and tokenize those transactions. Talk a little bit about some of the biggest changes in the industry. PCI certification is a moving target at best. If you can think back, probably early 2000s, maybe even up to 2005, when we used our personal credit cards. You signed the receipt, you were handed a receipt back, all 16 digits of your credit card number were on that receipt. So the first big change in about 2006 is that every terminal had to truncate the first 12 digits. So only the last 4 were visible. Well, as you can imagine, over the last 5, 6, 7 years, the industry is evolved. A lot of e-commerce, a lot of mobile devices. So, you know, it's an ever-changing, moving target. The good news is, as things change and as the merchant responsibility increases, it's up to whoever is processing your cards or managing that process to keep you in the loop. The Durbin Amendment, probably the biggest change from a financial standpoint in the last 20 years in the industry. For those that are not familiar with the Durbin Amendment, it was a senator named Dick Durbin out of Illinois. He went to the government and said, you should not penalize a merchant, or you should not charge a merchant more money if either A, their customer doesn't want to put in their 4-digit PIN number, or B, the merchant doesn't have the capability to capture that PIN. The government subsequently agreed, and in the fall 2011, they started regulating not all debit cards, but we're seeing about 80% of the debit cards coming through our portfolio are being regulated, and the regulated cost is 5 basis points and 22 cents per transaction. I won't call that free, but it's about as cheap as you can get in regards to a credit card. So take you back to the initial part of this presentation. I said that I thought the credit card industry was a legalized racket. So Durbin comes in the fall of 2011 and takes tens of millions of dollars away from Visa and MasterCard. So what does Visa do in the spring of 2012? They create a FAN-F fee to offset some of those losses. MasterCard subsequently comes in and does the same thing in the fall of 2013. So I don't think the industry will ever be regulated to the degree that it needs to be. At the end of the day, if MasterCard and Visa are going to set the rules, obviously merchants are going to have to play by those. But the class action lawsuit, not sure if anyone on the call has heard about this, but it's been ongoing for a few years. Ultimately, the lawsuit was settled in the favor of the merchants to the tune of a little over $6 billion. The merchants do not want the $6 billion, and it's currently being appealed. And the reason the merchants do not want the $6 billion is because, and trust me, Visa and MasterCard, they want to pay the $6 billion. Because if they pay the $6 billion, it keeps them in control in regards to the future pricing. So if they write a check for $6 billion to this fund, if you will, you can be rest assured there's going to be further increases that are going to help them offset that $6 billion expense. And then the last piece, and even though this is still probably about 18 months away, but it's called EMV, or you maybe heard of EMV regulations. The United States is the last country to actually implement this, or at least from a large country perspective. Some people refer to it as chip and PIN. So what EMV is the whole premise of this program is how do we reduce fraud in the credit card industry. Every acquirer and processor, which First Data is both, in 2013 had to be what they call EMV ready. So every First Data terminal that's on the market is EMV ready. The actual card issuing banks have to reissue all of their cards with a little chip in them by September 2015, and this regulation will go into play in October of 2015. And if you can think about it, I mean, I've had an American Express Blue card for years, and it's kind of a clear card, and you can see the chip inside of it. If I go to a gas station, I can wave that card in front of the pump, and it'll pick up my numbers. One of the big premises of this program is the card never leaving the cardholder's possession in an effort to reduce fraud, having employees write down credit card numbers, etc. So the information is still somewhat vague on EMV. It is going to be a regulation that is going to take place in about 18 months. Again, whoever's managing your credit cards at that time should be able to provide you enough information to make sure that you're compliant with the industry regulation. And then we're going to get into the benefits of the program, you know, for everyone on the call. We mentioned earlier that the Interchange Plus pricing model is the only model that benefits you, the merchant. That's obviously the program we have set up. It's pre-negotiated pricing. And what I mean by this, if you can think back, you probably had several people cold call you over the years and in order to see if they could save you money. Well, if you think about that scenario, you're essentially showing them what you're paying, and you may not have a great deal, so they could still come in, save you enough money to get you to switch, but not give you the best possible deal. Impact, and our office has agreed on a very aggressive pricing structure, which I'll break that down for you here in just a minute. But the nice thing is you're not negotiating against yourself. This is simply an exercise to say, here's where you're at today, here's where you could be. If the savings are there, then we can talk about the next step. Blanket approvals, meaning we do not require financials, nor do we require a personal guarantee. Keep in mind, after 9/11, the Patriot Act came out. In the Patriot Act, it mandates that every processor have the personal information for the signer on that account, so we do require that information for obvious reasons. Mentioned earlier that we're compatible with most standalone terminals, software applications, and POS systems. You have access to the GGE4, which is First Data's proprietary gateway. A lot of online tools and resources for you to manage your merchant account on the back end. And then First Data has 24/7, 365 customer service. What would the next step be? Ultimately, you can fax your statement to the number that's on that slide. I believe Melissa is going to make this deck available to everybody on the call. You would send that to Ashley Boozer. She actually manages our credit card team. I've included her phone number and extension on that slide, as well as her email address. And then any statements that we receive, we will reach out to you when we receive them to complete a cover sheet, just to learn a little bit about your environment. And then we'll schedule a time to present the results to you within 2 to 3 days. And then kind of an in conclusion slide. Your group impact is one of 60+ groups that have signed off on our program. Again, what really speaks to the program's viability is the fact that we've had less than 1% attrition for the last 6 years in an industry where 25 to 40% attrition is the norm. So, and there's a lot of reasons that factor into having a very low attrition. Number one, the average savings with this program, when you look at every single group, is a little over $4,000 annually. We've showed impact members savings. It's probably closer to $150,000 of aggregate savings, but I put $100,000 on the slide. When you look at our portfolio as a whole, you're right, we're managing $700 million of credit card receipts. We've saved our clients over $4 million in the last 12 months, and that's getting very close to $5 million. And then a little bit about our pricing. You know, think of the margins that you work on in your industry. We charge 10 basis points and a dime per transaction. There's some miscellaneous fees that usually do not equate to much more than 2 or 3 basis points. But when you think of that margin, I mean, it's a little over 0.1%. So that certainly is going to speak to, no one's going to come in and necessarily undercut us from a cost perspective. So as long as we're here when you need us, we don't change the plus portion of our pricing. That's an agreement we have with First Data. Obviously, we have no control over Interchange. That has always been a pass-through to the merchant. It will continue to be a pass-through in our model. But the nice thing is that our plus is not going to change. We'll make sure that you stay informed on whatever regulations you need to adhere to stay compliant. And ultimately, kind of open it up at this point. I'm not sure if there were any questions that came across, Melissa, but I'm more than happy to field anything.
If somebody does have a question, you can actually raise your hand and I can unmute you. Or you could just type it in the chat box if anybody has any questions. And again, if you want to get with Jerry after the call, we'll give you his information as well. But I don't see anybody putting up their hands. No questions? I guess it means you did a really thorough job.
There you go. All right, well, if any questions come up after the fact, obviously my contact information is on this last slide. And Melissa, were you going to get them a copy of the deck? Or?
Yes, I'm going to send everybody a copy of the presentation with your information, so we'll be good. And okay, guys, you don't have questions, so thank you for participating today, and we'll let you know about more training webinars as they come available. I appreciate your time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Jerry.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.